Welcome to Vintage SF. I'm Richard Rempel. Now with two cameras. Earth Abides by George R. Stewart, 1949. Isherwood Williams loved to visit his family's vacation cabin to retreat from the demands of society. But one day while out hiking, Ish is bitten by a rattlesnake, and the solitude he sought takes on a dire new significance. He is sick for days and often delirious, once waking to find two strangers peering in at him from the cabin door, then rushing away in fright, without offering to help him. Not long after, the coughing begins. Ish suffers chills and fever and a measles-like rash, but he survives. One of the few people in the world to live through it, but he doesn't know that yet. When he finally feels like himself again, Ish leaves the mountain to return home and notices the strangeness immediately. No cars pass him on the road. The gas station not far from his cabin looks abandoned, and he is shocked to see the corpse of a man untended on the roadside near town. Because of his isolation, Ish was unaware that humankind had suffered a lethal pandemic. George R. Stewart's influential classic Earth Abides tells the story of one man bearing witness as civilization unwinds and fades from the world. Can he survive the shock of the end of the Anthropocene era? Due to our recent pandemic, I think this novel has shown a rebound in interest, and rightly so. Stewart's pandemic kills off at least 99.9% of the population. In a trip across America at the beginning of this novel, Ish only comes across a handful of people. The mortality rate is astronomical. The novel is broken into three parts. Part 1, World Without End. Part 2, The Year 22. And Part 3, The Last American. Within each part, we have the story, but we also have these asides by the author in italics. The story itself is from the perspective of Ish, but these italicized asides by the author tells us more about what is happening in the world. At the end of each section, we also have a chapter called Quick Years. And if you see over here, it says, "Here ends part 1. The interchapter called Quick Years follows after a time interval of 1 year. Then Quick Years covers 21 years. That takes us to part 2, the year 22. So part 1, World Without End, takes about this much. Part 2, year 22, is this middle section. And part 3, The Last American, is this last section. Perhaps more of a coda or an epilogue to the story. It does complete the story. I want to talk in general about this book and discuss a couple quotes. In one of the italicized asides, Stewart says, "Biologically, man has for too long a time been rolling an uninterrupted run of sevens." Stewart loves to look at the big picture of life and geological time. With the disappearance of man, we see a lot of biological results. Some species flourish, they themselves become a pandemic, and then they're cut back. This leads you to wonder, is humanity a pandemic? Were we overpopulated and nature found a way to cut us back? Another area that is fascinating is how people find each other in this world. As they slowly begin to build family and community, we see that there are huge generational gaps. We have the generation before the pandemic, and then the generation that comes after the pandemic. This novel is set in California. The infrastructure remains for a time. The survivors have running water, electricity, vehicles, and food stocks. Eventually, things begin to unwind. As they lose electricity, they lose the ability to store food in freezers. Canned goods become very important. But even canned goods have shelf lives. In the same way, vehicles eventually break down. They rust, tires break down, and soon they're without vehicles as well. Ish wonders about the next generation. He thinks they need education and that libraries are keys to their community. However, that next generation basically just wants to live. They search for their daily food and water, then they love to play and fish and live life. We have a generation gap here. One young man says to Ish, "It is like the sun that keeps going round the earth, but naturally no one knows why or asks why. Why should there be a why?" Living in the moment instead of asking why. Ish has trouble with this. He wants a civilization that can sustain itself and rebuild. This tension plays throughout the novel. Stewart reminds me a little bit of Clifford D. Simic in the way that he can describe pastoral settings, but I think his character work is even better. And Stewart definitely does use metaphor. We have Ish, and then we have M. M is the woman that he partners with. Ish could have been a combination of two references or metaphors. One is an obvious reference to Ishai or Ishi, one of the last indigenous North American Indians of a certain tribe. Ishi's story was prominent in the time that this novel was written. The names Ish and M for Emma, the woman that he becomes a partner with, are references to Hebrew words. Ish means man in Hebrew, and M means mother. In fact, Ish sometimes refers to M as Mother of the Nations. This novel explores themes such as biology and its control on population. What happens when there is a drastic decline in population? And how do we replenish the earth? Here we have some biblical references, including the name of this novel. Much of the apocalyptic literature of the 1950s dealt with the nuclear threat and an aftermath. This novel stood out with its anthropological look at how population could be devastated by disease. It is a historically important novel. Earth Abides is a beautiful benediction to civilization. It lovingly tells the story of a man who straddles both sides of this pandemic. He becomes the last American. Stewart has a simplicity and eloquence in his writing. It is timeless. As Kim Stanley Robinson said in the introduction to this novel, it is a good story, well told. By the way, don't read the introduction before reading the story. I believe this is probably good advice for most novels. I loved Earth Abide. I give it 10 out of 10. It is a classic. Highly recommended. Sadly, it's the only science fiction novel that George R. Stewart wrote, but he did write many other good books. I haven't read any of them. Are there some that you would recommend? Have you read Earth Abides? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, keep reading.